The Rebbe Zilgesundheit began the Farbrengen this afternoon about today being Chai Elul. 18 days in the month of Elul, which is the Yom Heledes, the date of birth of the Shnei HaMa'oris HaGdolim, the Baal Shem Tov and the Alter Rebbe. And this date, Bichlal, that this date Chai Elul, is the birthday of the Shnei HaMa'oris HaGdolim. This is something which was revealed to us through the Rabbeim in later generations. In other words, in the days of the Alter Rebbe, or even the Mittel Rebbe, those days it was unknown about the Chashivas, about the fact of this day, that the Alter Rebbe and the Baal Shem Tov both share one Yom Heledes, that it is on the day of Chai Elul. And for this reason, it is today's Farbrengen. And the greatness of a Chassidische Farbrengen, the Rebbe stressed. We know how important, how great it is, especially based on what Chazal tell us. That whenever there is something taking place in the presence of 10 Yidden, the Shechina dwells there. How much more so is it that not only is this Farbrengen with more than 10 Yidden participating in it, but the Mokim, the place where the Farbrengen is taking place, is also a place of extreme important significance. The Rebbe said, the Farbrengen is taking place in the building where the Frierdiker Rebbe lived here for 10 years, and this is where he learned and davened for 10 years. So Mamela, we can imagine and understand the greatness of a Farbrengen, of a Chai Elul dike Farbrengen taking place in such a Mokim Choshev. And the Rebbe quoted the famous saying from the Rabbeim about Chai Elul, that Chai Elul gives life into Elul. In other words, in the Avodah of Elul, which the Avodah of Elul is based on Anila Doidi V'Doidi Li. First it's the reaction from the Yid to the Eibishter, that is the Anila Doidi. Then comes a reaction, a response back from the Eibishter to the Yidden, that is the V'Doidi Li. And all this is the Avodah of Chodesh Elul, based on what Chassidus explains, that there's an inyan of Isarusa de Latata, which is the awakening which comes from the Yidden Lamata. Then we know there's a concept of Isarusa de La'ela, which means the awakening whereby a Yid gets a Hisayraras Malmaila, Yid gets a Hisayraras to do something good. The Anila Doidi, this is the Isarusa de Latata, whereby the Yid expresses his love to the Eibishter. However, there is an Isarusa de La'ela that creates the Anila Doidi by Yid and Elul. And what is that? That is the fact, as Alter Rebbe, again, whose birthday is today, explains in Lekutei Torah the greatness of the month of Elul, that the month of Elul is a month when it is Melech Basada. So the atmosphere in itself is such, being that it is a time of Melech Basada, this in itself is already sets the pace for an atmosphere whereby Yidden can express a feeling of Anila Doidi, of themselves creating a Hamshacha, a thirst to the Eibishter. And thereby comes the response back from the Eibishter, the L'Doidi Li. Somewhere throughout the Sikha, it wasn't right here, the Rebbe also discussed, I think it was in Pirkei, but I started mentioning it already. The Rebbe discussed this, what Chazal say, the greatness of the Baskoil, that there's a Baskoil, B'chol Yom V'Yom, there's a Baskoil going out of HaChorev U'Machrezes Oilahem Labriyos Me'elbeino Shel Torah. In other words, there's a Baskol constantly screaming and awakening Yidden on the greatness and the importance of Torah, and not to embarrass Torah. Based on what Chassidus asks, who hears this Baskol? The whole idea of the Baskol, obviously, is that somebody should hear it and should bring somebody to awaken him. Baskol means a sound. Where do we hear the sound? Nobody actually ever hears the sound. So Chassidus explains that the sound is taka heard by Yidden, and that is why we see many times amongst many individual Yidden, at certain time we come to a feeling of a Hisayros. What brought about that all of a sudden we should have a feeling of awakening, that all of a sudden we should want to change our attitude and improve our attitude? This Chassidus Taiches comes as a result of this Baskol that sounds daily and calls Yidden. For example, there's the constant call Shuvu Banim Shevavim, which is also a constant call. Who hears it? The Neshamas Yisrael do hear it, and not only do Neshamas Yisrael hear it, but Taka respond to it. And the response is expressed when we see, from time to time, when Yidden get Hisayraras, which obviously we do not even see any reason what led to this particular Yisrael. So why is it that on this given day, a given individual got some sort of Yisrael to change his attitude? Elamai, this comes as a response to this baskoil which the Neshama Take hears. The Rebbe went into a extreme lengthy explanation on the whole union of giving chayis into the Avodah of Elul, which is the whole idea of Chay Elul, and the Anila Doidi V'Doidi Li. This is, regarding Chay Elul, irrelevant if Chay Elul falls out on a Shabbos, or Chay Elul will fall out on any other day of the week. How much more so is it when Chay Elul falls out on Shabbos? Because the day of Shabbos has many inyanim within itself. On one hand, we know that Shabbos is Mekacha V'Kaima. There's the Kedusha which the Rebbe gave into Shabbos, and Shabbos possesses this Kedusha which HaKadosh Baruch Hu has given it. On the other hand, Chassidus stresses that there's an inyan in Shabbos, V'Karasa La Shabbos Einig. We shall call Einig into Shabbos. What's the pshat? Who is the V'Karasa told to? The V'Karasa is told to Yidden. Yidden have a koyach to add in the great Kedusha of Shabbos, Yidden add Kedusha into this Kedusha, make it yet higher. This is what we say, the whole union of Shabbos is, Shabbos reminds on the concept of Olam Haba. Shabbos is a different world. Shabbos is a world of Kulei Ruchnias. Yom Menucha L'Chai Olam Haba. Because this is the whole union of Shabbos. So when Chay Elul falls out on Shabbos, how much more so is it the greatness of this day and this Farbrengen which is taking place on this great day of Chay Elul when Chay Elul falls out on the Shabbos. We also have this week's Sedra. Sedra begins with Kisava Yala Eretz, and that is the whole union of Eretz Yisrael, which there's also a taich from the Baal Shem Tov that Eretz stems from the word of Rotzoin. Expressing the idea of being willing to fulfill the Ritzoin, the will of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And here the Rebbe referred to a saying from the Tzemach Tzedek. Chassid once came to the Tzemach Tzedek and told the Tzemach Tzedek that he wants to go to Eretz Yisrael. It seems like the Tzemach Tzedek was not fond of the idea. The Tzemach Tzedek did not want him to leave Russia and go to Eretz Yisrael. So the Tzemach Tzedek responded to him in Yiddish, Mach da Eretz Yisrael. Make Eretz Yisrael here. What does it mean to make Eretz Yisrael here? Because Eretz Yisrael is not only merely something physical. Eretz Yisrael stands for the idea of the Shechina. Eretz Yisrael stands for the concept of Eretz Sherotzes Olases Retzayin Kaina. So the inyan of Eretz Yisrael, Tzemach Tzedek told him, Mach da Eretz Yisrael. Now that we're reading the Sedra of the Hoya Kisavei Ala Eretz, which this Sedra discusses about Yidden entering Eretz Yisrael, and right thereafter the Sedra discusses the obligation of Yidden to bring Bikurim. The Rebbe referred there's a machlokes in Tanoim when the Yidden were obligated to bring the Bikurim. According to the acceptable opinion, Yidden first began to bring Bikurim after being 14 years in Eretz Yisrael. They had to go through Sheva Shekafshu. It took them 7 years to conquer Eretz Yisrael. V'Sheva Shechalku, the 7 years till they divided Eretz Yisrael. This is one opinion. However, there's also an opinion in the Sifri that claims that as soon as Yidden entered Eretz Yisrael, they were immediately obligated to bring Bikurim right away. So this is what the Sedra here is talking about. V'hoya kisavei ala aretz, about entering Eretz Yisrael. So Eretz Yisrael is something which is not only limited to the geographic concept of where Eretz Yisrael is located. The idea, the spiritual thought of Eretz Yisrael is something which we can carry with us all over. The Rebbe referred very strongly to what the Gemara says. Talmidei Chachamim ein lahem menucha. Shenema yelchu mechayil al chayil. Talmidei Chachamim have no rest. And the Gemara quotes a pasuk, they will be going from step to step. Let us notice carefully the expression in Gemara. The Gemara is not talking about a Chacham. Obviously, a Chacham is a higher madrege than a Talmid Chacham. We're talking about someone he's only a disciple from a Chacham. He's a Talmid from a Chacham. So even about this individual as well, Gemara says, Ein lahem menucha. A person can never say that he has already achieved to a point where he will never grow further and further. Gemara says, Talmidei Chachamim ein lahem menucha. Shenema yelchu mechayil al chayil. They will go from one step to another. So the Rebbe is teaching, chayil in itself is already also a madrege. It's not the pshat he's at no level whatsoever. He's at a definition which can be defined. He's in a madrege of chayil. He's in a madrege of one level strength. So the pasuk says they will be going from one strength to another strength. This is what Torah demands from a Yid, that a Yid can never be satisfied. A Yid always, with his ruchnistic level, a Yid always has to strive to go mechayel al chayel. Constantly to keep on going higher and higher. Today's Haftarah is something which also has a very meaningful. The conclusion of today's Haftarah is with Be'ita Achishena, which is the famous pasuk about the coming of Mashiach. Kadosh Baruch Hu is saying the coming of Mashiach will be in time, and in time that He will hasten the time. So the Gemara asks, what's the pshat? Either it will be in a certain set time, Be'ita, which means the time, or Achishena, or Kadosh Baruch Hu will make it earlier. So the Gemara responds to this, Zachu, if Yidden would be Zaycha, then Mashiach will come, Achishena, then the Rebbe will rush the coming of Mashiach. Chas v'shalom, if Yidden will not be Zaycha, then it will be Be'ita, it will be in a certain time, but it must be. In other words, one way or another, but we must have the coming of Mashiach. It's extremely meaningful to us on this Shabbos, because in today's Haftarah we recite these psukim which stress about the guarantee of the Rebbe that Mashiach will definitely come and take us out of Golus. Being that today is the Yom Ledes of the Shnei HaMa'ores HaGdeilim, the Alter Rebbe and the Baal Shem Tov. So the Rebbe says, when he was thinking what kind of pasuk to choose to learn for today's Chumash and Rashi, as well thinking what kind of Perek and Pirkei Avos to learn for today's Pirkei Avos, thinks it will be most suitable to learn a pasuk as well as a Mishnah and Avos, which both have a shaykhs to the Baal Shem Tov and to the Alter Rebbe. And before the Rebbe began, in this week's Likutei Sichos, there's a little hakdama, the weekly Sicha that's published, which the Rebbe reviews. There's a little hakdama which the Rebbe wrote this week as an introduction to the Sicha. And in this hakdama, this preface, the Rebbe stresses the importance of Elul and talks about Chai Elul. And there he refers to the expression about Chai Elul being the birthday of the Alter Rebbe and the Baal Shem Tov, and uses the expression in Yiddish, the Shnei Ma'ores HaGdolim. These two Ma'ores HaGdolim that illuminated the world, the Baal Shem Tov and the Alter Rebbe. So it seems like a question was asked to the Rebbe that this is an expression which is taken from the Frierdiker Rebbe Sichos. And when the Frierdiker Rebbe uses the expression regarding Chai Elul as the birthday of the Shnei Ma'ores HaGdolim, he uses the expression in Yiddish, Unsere Shnei Ma'ores HaGdolim. Our two Ma'ores HaGdolim, the Baal Shem Tov and the Alter Rebbe. So the question, it seems like somebody wrote a note to the Rebbe, why did the Rebbe, we know by the Rabbeim everything is extremely accurate, why did the Rebbe change the expression in Yiddish from Unsere Shnei Ma'ores HaGdolim, and rather is writing the expression Di Shnei Ma'ores HaGdolim, without the stress of Unsere, ours. And the Rebbe based his response on expressions which we find by Avraham Avinu. By Avraham Avinu we find when whole union of Avraham Avinu was to make famous the Rebbe. As Chazal tell us on the pasuk, Vayikra Sham Avraham Kei Loilam. So the Chachamim tell us, Al Tikra Vayikra Ela Vayakri. Don't read the word Vayikra, but Vayakri, meaning that not only did Avraham call the Shem Hashem, he publicized it. He made it known to everybody. And if we look through the psukim where Avraham Avinu is involved, referring to the Rebbe, at times he refers to the Rebbe as Elokei HaShamayim, and at times he uses the expression Elokei HaShamayim v'Elokei Ha'aretz. Why is it that at certain times he refers to the Rebbeinu Shalom only as Elokei HaShamayim, and at other times we regard the Rebbe Elokei HaShamayim v'Elokei Ha'aretz? Rebbe explained as follows. Initially, when Avraham Avinu went over to a person and wanted to make the person close to Getlachkeit, close to Yiddishkeit, and familiarize him with the existence of the Rebbe, he couldn't have approached the person right away and tell him that the Rebbe is Elokei HaShamayim v'Elokei Ha'aretz. Why? The person was totally strange from the concept of godliness. So initially, he familiarized him that the Rebbe is Elokei HaShamayim. After familiarizing him that the Rabbeinu Shalom is Elokei HaShamayim, the next step was to introduce him as well that the Rabbeinu Shalom is Elokei HaAretz, and the Rebbeinu rules over everything which he created, and the Rebbeinu is all over the world. But this was something which he couldn't introduce up to a person right away. It went step by step. First it is Elokei HaShamayim, then it is Elokei HaAretz. The Elokim of all over. Same the Rebbe says, when the Frierdiker Rebbe used the expression initially, it was an expression only, unsere Shnei Me'ores HaGdolim, which is a limitation. They only have a shaykhus to us, to us Hasidim, to us Chabad. However, afterwards, now, the Baal Shem Tov and the Alter Rebbe have a shaykhus to each and every Yid. And if the Baal Shem Tov and Alter Rebbe have a shaykhus to each and every Yid, we cannot no more use the expression, the Yiddish expression of unsere Shnei Me'ores HaGdolim. We rather have to express ourselves, die Shnei Me'ores HaGdolim, because they have a shaykhus to each and every Yid. Where do we find in this week's Sedre, in Parshas Kisavai, an Inyan that has a shaykhus to the Alter Rebbe, as well as to the Baal Shem Tov? First, the Rebbe referred to Kapitel Chav Zayin, Pasuk Tes. Vayidaber Moshe v'Akohanim Alviyam al Kol Yisrael Leimer. They're addressing themselves to all the Yidden. Haskes Ushma Yisrael, listen Yidden. Hayoim Hazeh Niyesa La'am L'Hashem Elokecha. Today, this is the day that you have become a nation to Hashem. So Yisrael here is addressed to each and every Yid, not to Klal Yisrael as a nation, but the pasuk here is talking Haskes Ushma Yisrael. Listen, each and every Yisrael. Listen, each and every Yid. Really, Yisrael is an obvious shaykhus to the Baal Shem Tov. That was the Baal Shem Tov's name. So here the pasuk tells us, Haskis Ushma Yisrael, Hayoim Hazeh Niyesa La'am L'Hashem Elokecha. If we look into Rashi, Rashi quotes the words, Hayoim Hazeh, on this day, Niyesa La'am. This is the day that you have become a nation to Hashem Elokecha. Rashi says, the Rebbe right away comments, that there's some girses, there's some chamoshim, where they have the girsa that Rashi quotes all the 4 words from the pasuk, Hayoim Hazeh Niyesa La'am. There's another girsa and others that have Rashi quoting only 3 words from the pasuk, Hayoim Hazeh Niyesa, without the word of Liam. However the case may be, let us look into Rashi. What is the Pirush of Rashi? What does Rashi comment? B'chol yoim yiu beinecha ke'ilu hayoim basa imay bebris. That each and every day, it should be so fresh and so new to you, and so enthusiastic to you, that this is the day that you have came into a bond with the Rebbe. So what does Rashi teach the Hayoim Hazeh refers to? What happened on this day? The fact that Yidden got into a bond with HaKadosh Baruch. Question arises, even to those, according to those girses that quote the word Nihi, do not quote the word Li'am from the pasuk, but do quote the word Niyesa. Why is there need for Rashi to quote the word Niyesa? Actually, all Rashi is commenting on is on the words Hayoim Hazeh. That this Hayoim Hazeh, this day, that each and every day throughout all the generations, you should look at it with the same enthusiasm like it occurred on this day. So if so, Rashi should only quote the words Hayoim Hazeh. There's no need for Rashi to quote any other words. Let us go a little bit weiter in the same Sedra. And here the Rebbe chose a pasuk which has a shaykhus to the Alter Rebbe. What was the Alter Rebbe's name? Was Shnei Zalman. So to find a remes for the name Zalman, we cannot find that in the pasuk. Zalman is like a Yiddish type of a name. It's a shame. We use an expression. Slipped my mind. Use an expression. I'll answer questions later. He used an expression what these type of names are referred to. However, the name Shnei, we do find a remez in this week's Sedra. And that is in Pasuk Gimel of Kapitel Chaf Tes, towards the end of the Sedra, after Shvi. I'm sorry. The Pasuk there says, "V'loinosan Hashem lachem leiv ladas ve'inayim lirois v'oznayim lishmoya ad hayom hazeh." Until this day, you did not have a heart to understand, eyes to see, and ears to hear. Einayim lirois. Lirois is the Indian of oyer, has the lettering of oyer within it. Einayim lirois, 2 eyes to see the oyer, reflects the concept of shnei oyer. Because we know the Alter Rebbe, his name was Shneier, as it's always stressed. He was an oyer. He was an illumination in Nigla the Torah as well as in Pnimis HaTorah. So here we have a pasuk. The expression in the pasuk, Einayim lirois, reminds and the Alter Rebbe, whose name was Shneier. There the pasuk again uses the expression Ad Hayom Hazeh, until this day. Rashi explains the words Ad Hayom Hazeh as follows. Rashi begins, Shamati, I heard. A very rare expression in Rashi, the Rebbe says. We don't find Rashi using the expression Shamati, I heard. We do find, when Rashi does use the word he heard, he tells us who he heard it from. He heard it from Rabbi Isai. He heard it from his Rebbes. He heard it from somebody. In fact, there's an Indian that when you hear something from somebody, you say it to say it in behalf of the name whom we heard it from. Seems like Rashi has some sort of a reason that he says here Shamati and does not say who he heard it from and does not give it any kind of indication who he heard it from. Something very rare. Rabbi did not answer this. What does Rashi tell us here? A whole arichos. That on that given day, Moshe gave a Sefer Torah to the Bnei Levi. All of Klal Yisrael came complaining. Why are you giving the Sefer Torah only to the Shevet of Levi? We're all part of Torah. Are you giving the Torah away only to your Shevet? So Moshe was extremely happy when he saw within Yidden such a feeling of warmth and enthusiasm to the Torah. And that is why Moshe expressed himself. Hayoim hazeni yesola'am. On this day, you became a nation. Hayoim hazeh hivanti. On this day, I understood that you are attached to the Rebbeinu Shalom. Which pasuk is Rashi referring to? Rashi is referring to the pasuk we just learned a minute ago. Kapitel Chav Zayin, pasuk Tes. So how does Rashi teach at the end of the Sedra? Hayoim hazeni yesolayam. What happened on that day? That Yidden showed their attachment to Torah. That's how Rashi is teaching. Here at the end of the Sedra. How did Rashi teach on the spot before Hamishi in the pasuk? On this day, that constantly you shall express the same enthusiasm, just like on this day that you came into bond with the Rebbeinu Shalom. So at the end of the Sedra, Rashi teaches the Hayoim Hazeh that it has a shaykhus to Torah, and here in Kapitel Chav Zayin, pasuk Tes, where Rashi quotes the words from the pasuk, Rashi does not teach the words of the pasuk that it has a shaykhus to Torah. Rashi teaches the words from the pasuk that what happened on this day, they came into bris, they came into a bondage with the Rebbe. And this is something which requires interpretation. The Rebbe learns as follows. When there's based, the Rebbe says, that there is how Rashi is forced to interpret a pasuk on the spot, and how Rashi can learn a pasuk when it is not on the spot. On the spot where the pasuk is mentioned, that is where Rashi has to explain the pasuk in accordance to all the guidelines of Pshuta Shel Mikra. If we are looking here into pasuk Tes, Vayidaber Moshe v'Akohanim Alviyim al Kol Yisrael Leimer, Haskis U'Shma Yisrael, Hayom Hazeh Yisrael La'am L'Hashem Elokecha. Then we look further. We look into pasuk Yud. What is discussed in pasuk Yud? V'shamaita b'koil Hashem Elokecha. You should listen to the voice of the Eibishter. V'asisas mitzvaysav v'eschukav asher anochi mitzavcha hayom. Now this Vishamata, the Rebbe says, can be interpreted several different ways. It comes with a vav of attachment. So we know there's an union of a vav achibur, which can mean Hayom hazeh yesalam l'Hashem Elokecha, and you shall also Vishamata b'koil Hashem Elokecha v'asisa, you shall do es mitzvaysav eschukav asher anochi mitzavcha hayom. We can also learn Vishamata, that it's a separate union. Obviously, simplest way in Pshuta Shel Mikra is to learn that it comes as a continuation. Continuation is you shall listen to what the Rebbe tells you to do. Listening to what the Rebbe tells you to do means the fulfillment of mitzvahs. Does not mean the learning of Torah. Learning of Torah is one of the many mitzvahs. When we look at a pasuk says V'shamaita b'koil Hashem Elokecha v'asisas mitzvaysav v'eschukav asher anochi mitzavcha hayom. When we see such a pasuk, we are forced to interpret that this pasuk here is talking about the observance of mitzvahs. Pasuk here talks about the observance of mitzvahs. Therefore, Rashi has to interpret Ki'ilu hayom basa imay bebris. What's the pshat? Yidden came into a band with the Rebbe. What's the band for? For the fulfillment of mitzvahs. Comes weiter towards the end of the Chazarah. Here happens the incident with the Sefer Torah, whereby Moshe was extremely satisfied, and where Yidden expressed themselves so enthusiastically and so warm to the learning of Torah. This is why Rashi could also interpret that this pasuk also has a shaychus to Torah. It can also have the shaychus to Torah, but if first and foremost, in the realm of Pshuta Shel Mikra, the pasuk has a stronger shaychus to mitzvahs than to Torah. So that is why Alasar on the spot, Rashi has to interpret that the pasuk has a shaychus to mitzvahs. Because if we look, the child who's learning Chumash, looking at the pasuk V'shamaita b'koil Hashem Elokecha, listen to the voice of Hashem. What is the voice of Hashem? Fulfilling all the mitzvahs. Therefore, Rashi follows in the same continuation and interprets that the pasuk here talks about mitzvahs. Weiter, the pasuk can also have a shaychus to express the great warmth and tie which the Yidden showed to Torah. Being that this pasuk has a shaychus to the Baal Shem Tov, and the later pasuk the Rebbe is learning has a shaychus to the Alter Rebbe, it's expressed in the general attitude and difference between the Baal Shem Tov and the Alter Rebbe as well. Baal Shem Tov's inyan was, he came to be mechazik Yidden in mitzvahs. That was the Baal Shem Tov's inyan. The Baal Shem Tov came at a very bad time for Yidden. In fact, the Rebbe referred, that is why his name was also Yisrael, because he came at a time when Am Yisrael had to be awakened from their fainting spell. And just like we see Begashmis, when somebody faints and he's called by his name, this can have an effect, this has an effect on him and awakens him. The same, the Rebbe sent the Baal Shem Tov to awaken Klal Yisrael from their spiritual, from the Ruchni Madrega of a faint. And the Baal Shem Tov expressed it in his love to youngsters. The Baal Shem Tov instilled a warmth to mitzvahs by each and every Yid. The Baal Shem Tov went around amongst Pashat Yidden and asked them how they feel. And the Baal Shem Tov wanted to create with this that they should respond Baruch Hashem, Be'ezras Hashem, to get them accustomed, Shem Shamayim Shagor B'fiyim, to get them accustomed to the Rebbe's name, to get them close to the Rebbe, to get them close to mitzvahs. This was the whole union of the Baal Shem Tov. Baal Shem Tov's union was V'tzadik be'emunasoi yichyeh. There's a pasuk. So Chassidish Sfarim it's taiched V'tzadik be'emunasoi yechayeh. When Yidden have emunah in a tzaddik, this in itself brings life to Yidden. So B'meila, the Baal Shem Tov wanted to associate, bring a kesher between Yidden and tzaddikim. This was the union of the Baal Shem Tov. To bring life, he created a line of spiritual life which he brought to Yidden. Remember, this is the pasuk here where the pasuk stresses Ki'ilu hayoim basa imay bebris. Like today you came into a band with the Rebbe. And the Rebbe stressed the word bris is also accurate. We find the expression of bris, we find by bris milah. By bris milah, it's also an union of emunah. We take an 8-year-old child who does not, an 8-day-old child, who has no understanding of his own, and we bring them close to the Eibishter. This whole inyan of Bris Milah is also an inyan of Emunah. So that is why a pasuk that has a shaychus to the Baal Shem Tov is interpreted b'negei mitzvahs. However, when we come towards the end of the Sedra, in the end of the Sedra, the pasuk has a shaychus there to the Alter Rebbe. What is the whole inyan of the Alter Rebbe? The whole inyan of Sidus Chabad is the philosophical understanding of all these inyanim. This is what Chabad introduced. It's not enough v'tzadik b'munasa yichye, yechaya, to rely on having a munah and a tzaddik, and this takes care of everything. Chabad demands that we have to learn ourselves and we have to daven ourselves. Chabad demands a tremendous amount of intellectual learning, requires a tremendous amount of learning from a person. That is why the pasuk that deals the pasuk of Einayim Liros, which the Rebbe is teaching, this has a shaychus to the Alter Rebbe of Shnei Oyer. That pasuk there is talking about Torah, because this is the whole inyan of the Alter Rebbe's shitta. Hasidus Chabad stresses the greatness, this is the whole inyan of Chabad, Chochma Bina Das, the greatness of learning Torah, of understanding all these inyanim which the Baal Shem Tov introduced, only at a level of Emunah. This is taken apart in Chabad and brought down into Chochma Bina Das, into understanding. This is Benegeya, the Parsha Chumash. Benegeya Pirkei Avos, being that until Rosh Hashanah we have to finish Pirkei Avos, so this week and next week we recite 2 Prakim in one Shabbos. And today, this afternoon, we recited Perik 3 and 4, and next week we'll recite Perik 5 and 6. And by doing this, we will conclude Pirkei Avos before Rosh Hashanah. So again, the Rebbe says he's looking for a Mishnah in Perik Shlishi, what should have a shaychus to the Baal Shem Tov, and a Mishnah in Perik Revi, which will have a shaychus to the Alter Rebbe. In Perik Shlishi, Mishnah Yud Dalet. Hu hayayim, referring to Rabbi Akiva. Chaviv Adam shenivra b'tzelem. Chiba Yisayron Edas Loi Shenivra B'Tzelem. Person is very dear that he was created with a Tzelem Elokim. An extra amount of love was expressed to him for being created with the Tzelem Elokim. That's what the Mishnah says. Mishnah goes on, Chaviv in Yisrael. Now here we have already the open shaychus to the Baal Shem Tov, because the Mishnah again does not talk about Klal Yisrael, but each and every Yid, each and every individual is referred as Yisrael. And as we know, Rebbe stresses, amongst Klal Yisrael there are 2 Shemos. There's a Shem of Yaakov and there's a Shem of Yisrael. Yisrael is the name that shows Yidden on a higher Madrege. Yisrael is combined, it's explained in the Chassidus of 2 words, the words Li Roish. So deals with Roish as opposed to Yaakov, who deals with the level of Okev, Yud Okev. Chaviv in Yisrael, the Mishnah goes on, how dear are Yisrael, how dear are Yidden, shenikru ubanim lamokim, they are referred to as children lamokim. Chiba Yisayron edas lahem, an extra amount of chiba, shenikru ubanim lamokim, shnem abanim atam l'shem elokech. Mishnah goes on further. Chaviv in Yisrael, shenitan lahem klei chemda, Chiba Yisayron edas lahem, that the klei chemda, a very dear and precious thing, was given to them. What is it? Naturally, Torah. Shenitan lahem klei chemda. So the Rebbe says, if we notice, the Mishnah keeps on stressing again an expression of love and again an expression of love to Yidden. It's 4 expressions of higher and higher madreges of chiba, of love, which the Rebbe expresses to Yidden. However, the Rebbe is learning the Mishnah as follows. The beginning of the Mishnah, Chaviv Adam Shenivra B'Tzelem, refers to Yidden in one level, as opposed to later, Chaviv in Yisrael Shenikru Ubonim Lamokim. What is the difference? We know that there are 2 madregas in Yidden. Yidden are madrega of an eved, of a dear servant. There's a relationship between the Rebishter and Yidden as a relationship between a master and a servant. However, there is also a relationship like between father and son. How great the relationship between master and servant is. This is what the Mishnah stresses in the words Chaviv Adam Shenivra B'Tzelem, Chiba Yisera Nedas Lo Shenivra B'Tzelem. The relationship of father and son is a much closer relationship as the relationship between master and servant. That is why the Mishnah goes further. Chaviv in Yisrael Shenikru Banim Lamakim. This is a higher madrege, a higher expression of chavivus, of dearness, which is existing among Yidden and the Eibishter, because Yidden have the title of children and the Eibishter has the title of a father. Very obvious, the Rebbe says. A child, a prince, will go into his father's oitzreis, into the most dearest treasures which the royal king has, which are put away there for many generations and are extremely dear to the kingdom and to the king himself. And the child, his own child, will be able to go over there and play with it and have access to it. However, the dearest servant, how dear and dedicated he may be to the king, to his master, still will not have an access to the oitzchos yikarim, to the dear treasures that are ba'otzach hamelech. So this in itself already shows on a very close chiba, a close dearness, expression of love which exists between Yidden and the Eibishter in the level of Banim. The same thing is on the other hand. The other side. We see it's stressed in Chassidus, the Maggid of Mizrich, in two of his Svarim, the Rebbe quoted, the beginning of two of his Svarim, discusses this inyan, and describes at length how a father gets involved to play with a child. And we're talking about a child who may still be crawling on all four. And a child who is, on the intellectual level, is extremely far from his father's intellectual level. And the child is busy playing with his toys and with his things. And the father gets involved, and his mashbilas atzmai lowers himself and plays with the same toys and with the same tchachkalach that the child is playing with. What is this? I mean, it's by far not on the intellectual level of the father to be involved playing with such type of toys as he's involved doing. However, this is an expression of love and close association whereby the father gets involved with his little infant and is involved together with him to such an extent. And this is what the Mishnah here says. Chaviv in Yisrael, the love that exists between Yidden and the Eibishter is shenikru banim lamakim. Not only is there a relationship between Yidden and the Eibishter as a relationship between a dear servant and his master, but there's a much stronger relationship. There's a relationship of banim lamoker. Chaviv in Yisrael. Chiba yiseiron edas lahem shenikru banim lamoker. Shenema banim atem l'Hashem Elokeichem. Then the Mishnah goes on. Chaviv in Yisrael shenitan lahem klei chemda. Yidden are very dear because something extremely dear, a klei chemda, was given to them. Here the Rebbe raised the question. We're making such an issue with the Baal Shem Tov and the Maggid. Let us look at the world, what the world really looked like before the Baal Shem Tov. Before the Baal Shem Tov, the Rebbe says it was also a beautiful world. There were great Gedolei Yisrael. There were great giants in Kabbalah and Nister as well, as in Nigla the Torah as well, and there were beautiful generations even prior to the Baal Shem Tov. However, the Rebbe is teaching, there's a chiba yiseiron edas lahem shenitan lahem klei chemda. The Baal Shem Tov did introduce something special which was not in existence prior to the Baal Shem Tov as well. How great Taka the world was before the Baal Shem Tov. And generations before, the world was in a beautiful situation. There were great Gedolei Yisrael and so forth. However, the Baal Shem Tov introduced this inyan of Chiba Yiseiron Edas Lahem, this extra measure of love the Baal Shem Tov introduced amongst Klal Yisrael. And this is something which Taka came from the Baal Shem Tov and was not in existence prior to that. So the Rebbe is teaching in this Mishnah on various levels. Otherwise, the Rebbe says, why does the Mishnah start talking about all different types of chiba, of love, which is in existence between the Eibishter and Yidden? Mishnah is talking about various levels of chiba, of warmth, which are in existence between the Eibishter and Klal Yisrael. Now we will turn to the Mishnah that has a shaychus to the Alter Rebbe, and that is in the 4th Perek. A brief introduction. The Rebbe says this afternoon that the Alter Rebbe made the Siddur, which actually the Alter Rebbe composed, put together in Nusach HaTfilah, which we follow. And it's very strange, the Rebbe says, that the Alter Rebbe put Pirkei Avos into the Siddur. And if we look carefully, we will take a notice that there are shinuyim, there are changes between the Pirkei Avos, as the Alter Rebbe put Pirkei Avos into the Siddur, as it is in Mishnah. And one of them is very obvious in Perek Revi. In Mishnayos, Rabbi Meir is mentioned once in Perek Revi, and that is Mishnah Yud. Rabbi Meir says, "Havei memayit be'esek." Do not be involved too much in Esek. V'asoik b'Torah. Your main involvement shall be in Torah. Let us turn towards to the end of the Perek, at the end of Mishnah Chaf. Rabbi Meir Omer, al testakel bekankan. Do not look into the vessel. Do not judge it as the keli. Ela b'meshe yesh bo. Look what is in it. Here the Rebbe says, in Mishnayos, this saying is not quoted in the name of Rabbi Meir, Rabbi Omer. And the Alter Rebbe quotes this also in the name of Rabbi Meir. So we have in Pirkei Avos of Perek Dalet, we have twice Rabbi Meir. Meir is the inyan of oil. Shnei oil again. So Mamela, for this afternoon, which is a Chai Eldik Farbrengen, it would be very suitable to discuss these Mishnahs that deal with the concept of Shnei oil. So the Rebbe is going to discuss the Mishnah Yud, which is a quotation of Rabbi Meir, as well as the latter part of Mishnah Chaf, which is also a quotation of Rabbi Meir. Mishnah Yud. Rabbi Meir tells us, "Have a memayit be'esek." We shall be involved very little in business. V'asoik b'Torah, and be involved. Your main involvement shall be in Torah. Actually, who is Rabbi Meir talking to? Rabbi Meir is talking to a Jew. Pashat, as we learned in Mishnah. Rabbi Meir is talking to a Jew who can be defined as a Zvulun Jew. What do we mean by a Zvulun Jew? A Jew whose inyan is, he's a merchant, he's involved in business, and at the same time he's supporting Torah. So Rabbi Meir is telling us, have a memayit be'esek. Even to this individual, you shall know, try and do as little as possible of Esek, and v'asoik b'Torah. Try and grab as much as time away to be able to learn Torah. That's the question. There's a Gemara in Kedushin. Gemara in Kedushin there discusses about an obligation of a father to teach an occupation and a profession to his son. Occupation to his son. Should be able to have panos. After the Gemara finishes discussing this inyan, Rabbi Meir Omer, there's a saying from Rabbi Meir, the same Rabbi Meir from over here. What does Rabbi Meir say there? Maniach ani kol umne shabiyayla veini melamed es beni ela Torah. Rabbi Meir says, I will not teach my child, leave aside all occupations, all worldly occupations. I'm not involved with. However, what I will teach my child is only Torah. So we see that Rabbi Meir was a person that by him the inyan of the Esek played no role whatsoever. And Rabbi Meir looked at Torah, that the obligation of a person is to be involved only in Torah. That's how Rabbi Meir looked at it. Comes here in Pirkei Avos. Rabbi Meir tells us, have a memayit be'esek, do little esek, v'asoik b'Torah. Here in Kedushin we have the same Rabbi Meir telling us that he will not teach his son anything but Torah. So Rabbi Meir here should say the same. Don't do any esek at all, learn Torah. It's the same Rabbi Meir. So here he tells us no. Minimize an asik, and the rest of the free time you should learn Torah. One question. Now we will turn to the second Rabbi Meir. Second Rabbi Meir tells us, al tastakel bekankan. Do not look at the vessel, do not look at the keli, ela b'mashi yesh bo. Yesh kankan chodosh. It could be a vessel that is a new vessel. However, mala yasham. It is full of old. What does the Mishnah refer to? Meaning full of old wine. Old wine is something which is very much looked up to. How's the expression in Gemara? Yain yashan shadas zikenim noichahimenu. Elderly people would enjoy a cup of old wine, something which they enjoyed very much. V'yoshan, and there's possible should be an old vessel, shafilu chodesh ein bo, that does not even have a drop of new wine in it. So actually what Reb Meir is really saying, do not judge a person by his outside. That's really what Reb Meir is saying. You have to look at the inside of the person. So first of all, the Rebbe is raising the question, why does Reb Meir have to talk in a vocabulary of a kankan, with chodesh and yoshan? Let Reb Meir get to the point. Let him describe us, we're talking about a person. And this person, you have to look at him, not on his outside, judge a person by what he's full with. Let's leave question.
Somebody's caught blocking again, he's got to get out of here in a hurry. Does anybody have a...
Actually, when we're talking about a kankan, we're talking about a barrel, about a vessel that contains wine. Wine, you didn't make kiddush on wine, and you didn't make havdalah on wine. Kiddush, the Rebbe stresses, is an union of asay toiv. Introduces kedusha, brings in the Shabbos. Havdalah means separation. Yid always has to know to draw a line of separation. That's the concept of sur mera, to be able to stay away from the evil, to know what to get involved with and what to not get involved with. However, back to our question, why does Reb Meir use such an expression? The Rebbe is explaining, if we look at Mishnah Chaf is a quotation of Elisha ben Avuya. Elisha ben Avuya was Reb Meir's Rebbe. And if we know the biography of Elisha ben Avuya, he later went off the proper path. So that is why Reb Meir, as a disciple of Elisha ben Avuya, finds it as his obligation to teach us, al testakil bekankan. Don't judge a person by his outside. Al testakil bekankan ela b'ma sheyesh bo. At times there may be a kankan chodesh that's mola yoshan, or there may be a yoshan shafilu chodesh ein bo. In other words, this Reb Meir here is using as means of emphasis himself why he was involved, why he was learning Torah from a person like Elisha ben Avuya. So Reb Meir is explaining this with an introduction of al testakil bekankan. Don't judge a person by his outside. Here the Rebbe says there are two taichen in the Arizal that have a shaykhs to this Mishnah. One of them, the Arizal teaches as follows. There's a pasuk, v'nakei lo yinakei, meaning that the Rebishter will not be moichel, chas v'sholem, for averos. He will not forgive. Nakei, or yinakei, v'nakei lo yinakei, it's composed of the word, same lettering as kankan. Kuf nun, kuf nun. Nakei has the same words, nun and a kuf. So the Arizal teaches, even though the Torah tells us, v'nakei lo yinakeh, that for certain averas the Rebishter will not forgive. So that comes Reb Meir and tells us, al testakel bekankan. Do not pay attention to what the pasuk says, nakei lo yinakeh, to the lettering of kankan. Ela b'meh sheyesh bo. What is the meh? Ma. Ma is the Indian of the Rebbeinu Shalom. Ma stands for bittul. See, this always stresses. The Rebbeinu Shalom will always forgive. Even where there is an Indian of nakeh, of kankan, where the pasuk tells us nakeh lo yinakeh, don't pay attention. The door for forgiveness is always open. Al testakel bekankan ela b'meh sheyesh bo. There's a meh referring to the Rebbeinu Shalom that comes along with it, and this always leaves room for forgiveness. Rebbe says, there's a taich from the Arizal, whereby he teaches a phrase of the Mishnah. However, you cannot go on teaching the whole Mishnah based with this, on this Inyan. So what we do, however, see that at times authentic Mefarshim take out a phrase of a Mishnah and teach this little part of the Mishnah, not taking in consideration the later parts of the Mishnah that it also has to agree, shtim, with this teich. That is one teich that the Arizal says. Then there's another teich. Which is also from the Arizal, also in this Mishnah. The Arizal says that kankan refers to matat. Matat is Sori Shaloilam. He's the Malach, he's the Ha, who the Rabbeinu Shaloilam appointed to take care of matters for the world. However, Rab Meir says, a Yid has to know, Al Testakel Bekankan. Don't think that the world is led by Matat, who is referred to as Kankan. There's the Meh, again, the Rabbeinu Shaloilam, who is behind him, and the Rabbeinu Shaloilam is really the one who is ruling this world. There is a Kankan, the Rebbe goes on, what is Chodosh Mola Yoshan, and there's a Yoshan Shafilu Chodosh Ein Bo. What's the pshat of Kankan? What's the pshat of barrel? A vessel, a barrel. Rebbe says this refers to each and every one of us. Each and every one of us is in the position of a Kankan, and everyone has a shlichus that we have to fulfill in this world. And there are many of us that consider themselves, we are Chodosh, we are youngsters, we are young, and we don't want to get involved with our real obligation of spreading Yiddishkeit and spreading the Mifzoyim, and as well, when the Rebbe mentioned Mifzoyim, the Rebbe also mentioned today the importance of learning Chitas daily. Of all this, we feel we are Chodosh. Why should we get involved in it? So the Mishnah tells us no. If you are a Kankan, you have this Yayin within you. What is Yayin actually? Yayin in spiritual sense refers to Chassidus. Having a Shaykhs to the Rabbeim. Straight down all the Rabbeim, from the Baal Shem Tov, through all the Rabbeim, which we were gifted to have a Shaykhs to. If we are in a position of a Kankan, though we may consider ourselves Chodosh, however, if we have wine within ourselves, we have to give this wine. Here the Rebbe says, we just discussed the greatness of old wine. However, there's a plus in new wine as well. What is the difference between an old wine has an Indian das keinem neuchaimenu? There are certain elderly people who enjoy the effect that an old wine, aged wine, brings to them. However, the koch, this is something which only young wine has. An old wine, this does not exist. In other words, in youngsters, there's a maila, in the Chodosh, there's a maila that the Indian of a koch, the Indian of enthusiasm, is something which is given to youngsters. So this, the Rebbe stresses, there are those that can be defined as Chodosh, as youngsters. However, we are still obligated to give our share, our full share, not to say that we cannot, or we are too young, or we don't have what to offer, we don't have what to give. If we have a shaykhs to the Rabbeim, we have a shaykhs to Chassidus, we possess within ourselves this inyan of Yayin. We possess within ourselves the inyan of Pnimi Satayra. And this Pnimi Satayra, whether it is Yoshan, whether it is Chodosh, we have to share it and bring it to each and every Yid. There are those that can be defined as Yoshan. They are old. They are old, and they claim that they learned in Lubavitch, they learned in Timchet Mimim, the Rebbe says, 40 years ago, 50 years ago. And today they consider themselves old and weak, and they don't have no koyach to be involved in the union of Mifzoyim, to be involved and strongly involved, stretching out an arm to assist other Yidden and so forth. They taine, they have no koyach. So there's a pasuk the Rebbe says, V'koyve Hashem yachlifu koyach. The one that has hope, the Rebbe will exchange koyach. What's the pshat? Will exchange koyach. What does the pasuk mean? Rebbe says, Svarim Taich. If a person feels weak, take your weak koyches and give them to the Rabbeinu Shalom. Exchange with the Rebbe. Make an exchange with him. Yachlifu, echlipin means an exchange. You give him your weak koyches. You claim you have no koyach to do. Give this away to the Rabbeinu Shalom. The Rabbeinu Shalom will refresh you with new koyches. He will give you new and strong koyches. So therefore, the one that considers himself a Yashan, he also has to get to work. Otherwise, he's afilu Chodosh Ein Bo. Otherwise, he does not possess anything. He's a Yashan, he's an old timer, he saw things in Timchet Mimim many years ago, and 40 years ago, or 50 years ago, as the Rebbe expressed himself. He learned in Timchet Mimim. He also has to be strongly involved in giving for himself and reaching out to other Yid. The Rebbe spoke, and he stressed that there's a mila in old wine, and then there's a mila in fresh wines. This is obviously, it's contradictory. The Rebbe says, don't be concerned. If we look at Jewish history, it's constantly contradictory. We see constantly in Yonim that contradict each other. This in itself, how Yidden am ausgehalten throughout all these Golas and throughout all these Saras, to whatever Yidden went through throughout all these thousands of years, this in itself is contradictory one to another. How is it possible that Yidden were able to halt us? And Rebbe cited another example. On one hand, we have two quotations from the Rebbe Marash, which are also pretty contradictory one to another. On one hand, we know that the Rebbe Marash is the one that demands l'katchila hariba. Notice the Rebbe keeps on quoting the Rebbe Marash. And Rebbe Marash's approach to each and everything was to go above and beyond everything. On the other hand, there's an expression from the same Rebbe Marash, where Rebbe Marash discussed the hardships Yidden have with Parnassah. The Rebbe Marash used the expression that Parnassah by a Yidden is just as miraculous, is the same nest like the man which the Yidden had in the middle. Shows that come on to Parnassah, it's not easy to earn a proper living. And it's an inyan which is like a nest, how the Rebbe provides each and every one with all our needs. So we do see that there's an inyan of contradictory inyanim in Torah, which the Rebbe did not get involved into explaining in detail. Now let us go back to the Mishnah, based how we teach this Mishnah, that we are able to teach us one part of the Mishnah, like the Arizal did, not getting involved with the other details of the Mishnah. We will do the same here in the quotation of Rab Meir, in the first part of his quotation. Rab Meir tells us, have a mamayit be'asik v'asik b'Torah. Minimize in asik and learn Torah. You know what Rab Meir is talking about? Rab Meir is not talking about here about any asik of business. Rab Meir is talking about a completely different asik. Rab Meir, his inyan was Torah. That was his inyan. As we take a fine in Gemara in Kedushin, whereby Rab Meir expressed himself, he will not get involved with teaching a child anything else other than Torah. Fine, Benegei Reb Shimon ben Yochai, his inyan was also Torah. Rashbi was always learning Torah. So there's an expression in Yerushalmi, just quoted off in the Chassidus, that raises the question, what did Rashbi do with all mitzvahs? Klum. How did he regard sitting in a sukkah, benching on a lulav? All these are inyanim and mitzvahs which have to interrupt the person from learning Torah. This is what the Mishnah here is referring to asik. That's the asik as opposed to learning Torah. We're not taught asik normally meaning business. However, here we mean a different type of an asik. Asik here means involvement. It means the spiritual involvement which one has. So Rab Meir is telling us. Rab Meir is talking to a person whose inyan is only Torah. So Rab Meir is telling this person, minimize your activities. What type of activities? Your mitzvah activities. You have to do them. There's no alternative. You have to fulfill the will of the Rebbeinu Shalom. However, minimizing them is spending time in them as much as possible. And this fits in to the philosophy of Rab Meir. Because Rab Meir's inyan was, as he says in Kedushin, Rab Meir's inyan is Torah. Therefore, comes here, Rab Meir says, a person who's solely involved in the learning of Torah, a person like the caliber of Rab Meir, like the caliber of Rashbi. We're not talking about people in average levels. We're talking about people whose inyan is, if we should use the term, Torasam umnasam. Torah is their occupation. To these people, Rab Meir is addressing himself. Have a mamayit basic, minimize your activities of mitzvahs, do them, you have to do them, but minimizing them as much as possible. So here again we have both of these Mishnahs, in actually three Mishnahs, Mishnah Perek Shlishi, which has a shaykhus to the Baal Shem Tov, and the Mishnahs, the two Mishnahs in Perek Revi, both Meir, having the word Rabbi Meir, the inyan of Oyer, twice Rabbi Meir, according to the Girs of the Alter Rebbe, which is the inyan of Shnei Oyer. So here we have Perek Revi has a shaykhus to the Alter Rebbe, whose birthday is the Baal Shem Tov, and the Alter Rebbe is both on Chayel. Towards the end of the Farbrengen, the Rebbe said that to take along from today's Farbrengen, for those people who are here present at today's Farbrengen and will not be here on Rosh Hashanah, Askonim, people who are involved in other cities and other countries, and Shluchim as well from other cities and other countries, the Rebbe called them over and gave them each a bottle of mashke. The Rebbe said that when they come back to their cities or countries, they shall make a Hasidische Farbrengen, and as spoken about in the first Sikha, the greatness of a gathering of 10 people, as the Alter Rebbe discusses in Tanya, whereby at least 10 are, there's always the presence of the Shechina, excuse me. And at this Farbrengen, to utilize the Farbrengen, is saying over a Torah from the Baal Shem Tov and the Alter Rebbe, whose date of birth it is today. So they will have the inyan of Torah, also tying it in with the inyan of Tzedakah, as well as with the inyan of Tefillah, which this ties in with all the 3 kavim of Torah, Avodah, and Gemilas Chasod. 3 kavim. And this will also bring about, the Rebbe says, the 3 kavim of Avas Hashem, Avas Yisrael, and Avas HaTorah, which are also a Raisa, V'Kudshe Brichu, V'Yisrael, HaKul Echad, they are all one. It will also bring about from the Rebishter the result of a bracha mishuleshes, a triple bracha. What is the meaning of a triple bracha? Because the bracha, which Kohanim recite, the bracha which is mentioned in Torah, Yevrachecha Yoel Yisa, is 3 psukim, it's a triple bracha, and will also bring about to a special strengthening in all the 3 inyanim of Am Yisrael, Teiras Yisrael, and Eretz Yisrael, that each one of them should be shalom, shall be complete, and shall not be able to be harmed by any outside inyanim. But Eretz Yisrael and Am Yisrael and Teiras Yisrael shall all be b'shlei musam.